We want our doctors to treat us as individuals. What we don't want is for them to lump us in with everybody else who kind of looks like us, some kind of identity group. And in a world where identity politics has taken over the discussion in so many realms, we would hope that our medical establishments might be able to avoid that. But unfortunately, that's not the case. If we have seen in doctors' offices to medical schools, even to medical dramas. I don't know if you've seen The Pit, but that's a lot of identity politics right there. We have seen identity politics creep in, and we've seen its negative effects, particularly in the fight over gender-affirming care. So what are we going to do about it all? Well, improving that situation is the mission of our guest today, Dr. Stanley Goldfarb. Dr. Goldfarb has a long history as a teacher, researcher, and practitioner of medicine. He's also been a keen observer of the shift that the medical profession has taken over the last couple decades, and particularly in the last couple years, toward this identity politics issue. He wrote the wonderfully titled book, Take Two Aspirin and Call Me by My Pronouns in 2022. And that called attention to the problem of identity politics in our medical profession. And then more recently, in September of 2025, published Doing Great Harm, How DEI and Identity Politics Are Infecting American Healthcare and How We Are Fighting Back. And how they are fighting back is with a great organization called Do No Harm, which he founded back in 2022. And we're going to dive into that and this whole issue. Dr. Goldfarb, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, great to be with you, Peter.
Okay, let's start with the medical schools, because you always hope they are kicking out the very best doctors. And one of my frustrations with the conservative movement broadly is that we sometimes, we'll be the dog that caught the car legislatively or with legal victories, and we won't fully follow through. I have some concern we're doing that on the medical school front. You probably remember the Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard Supreme Court case that said you had to do away with affirmative action in higher ed. And then, of course, the Trump administration has been really pushing to get rid of DEI at every level of the university system, including med schools. But that doesn't seem to be totally winning the day. Tell us about your experience getting kicked off the board of Old Dominion University and what that tells us about where we are with some of this identity politics stuff.
Yeah, well, thank you. That was an interesting experience. And I should just say that the whole goal of Do No Harm is actually to do stuff. So I hope we'll get a chance to get through some of the effects that we've been able to have. The ODU board was interesting. So Old Dominion University, which is a nice university down in Norfolk, Virginia, caters mostly to the local community. And a few years ago now, it merged with a medical school, Eastern Virginia Medical School, whose clinical activities were run by a for-profit organization. And the idea then was to bring it into the university system. It was having some financial problems as well, I believe. And I was appointed to the board by Governor Glenn Youngkin, I think in part because there really was a new responsibility that the state had now for this medical school, and he was interested in having some people who represent the state, which is the nature of the board members of universities in Virginia. They're representatives of the Commonwealth of Virginia and the taxpayers of Virginia. His idea was to have someone there who could sort of look over and see what they were up to. And at my first orientation meeting, it was very pleasant down in Norfolk. And they talked about giving me football tickets and merchandise and all sorts of things. And I said, what I really want to do is see the curriculum of the medical school. And they said, no, you can't do that. You have to go through the president of the university, and we don't want the board members getting involved in the running of the university. I said, I wasn't getting involved in running the university. I was involved in the governance of the university, and I needed to have some idea of what the university and the medical school were actually teaching. And then we went back and forth to a couple of meetings, and finally I said to them that I was going to introduce a board resolution that I'd be allowed to meet with the dean, which they had also prohibited, and I have an opportunity to review the curriculum, as I said, which prohibited. And they said, no, why don't you wait? I told them this in order to be a good colleague. I didn't want to drop this in the middle of a board meeting. I wanted to alert them that I was doing that. And they said, no, let's talk about it. And the next thing they did was contacted the state legislature and had me removed from the board. The state legislator has to approve all board members that the governor appoints. So that was my experience at Eastern Virginia Medical School. And I think it illustrates a real problem that's in medical education is that there's been a control of the institutions, a marching through the institutions, the way it's been termed, in many spheres of American life. And medical schools have been in lots of ways at the vanguard of this march. And they have no desire to give up control of something that they truly believe, which is, as you mentioned, identity politics ought to be a crucial part of medical education.
And nuance this a little bit because, you get into these conversations, you end up talking about diversity a lot. Diversity can be a little bit of a lightning rod. It's not per se that you're saying diversity is bad. It's that diversity for diversity's sake is the problem. Is that fair?
Yeah, I couldn't care what the medical school class looks like as long as it was the very best people that were available. And we do know that the criteria that have traditionally been used for uh, choosing students to go into medicine, and mind you, there are 55,000 applicants for 22,000 spots. So it really is a zero-sum game here. And the idea is that it should be the best people. I think diversity is sort of an irrelevancy in medicine, to tell you the truth. I have no problem if I encounter lots of diversity, as long as what I'm encountering are the best people that are available and not ones that are chosen because of the diversity issue as opposed to their individual merit.
And are we seeing some horror stories along the way? I mean, some doctors that really shouldn't be there getting socially promoted through the system and actually coming out the other side and creating harms?
Well, one of the problems in medicine is to try to measure quality and physician effect is a very difficult thing because when people really become ill, they end up in hospitals and they're cared for by lots of different people, teams of people. What we do know, though, that is there's there are some interesting data now that show that the performance on exams, for example, the certifying exam to be a board certified hospitalist taking care of patients in the hospital, that score does predict patient outcomes. And if we work our way back, we know that performance as a resident, predicts your performance as a physician. And we now know that performance of a medical student predicts your performance as a resident. And finally, performance on uh, on examinations such as the MCAT exam, the achievement test to get into medical school, predicts your performance as a medical student. So if we take that chain together, we can expect that taking students into medical school with lower performance on medical college achievement tests, as opposed to students with higher performance, is going to lead to students and ultimately physicians who are less effective. We also know some horror stories. There was one famous black institution in Los Angeles, the Drew Medical Hospital, which eventually closed down because the performance there was so awful, and that the quality commission that governs hospital accreditation said, you just can't have your doors open, and it catered exclusively to black patients and almost exclusively to black physicians. So we have data that there are there are minority physicians that are being pushed through, and we know that that's the case. We know they're being admitted to medical school with lesser credentials, and we know that they're being pushed through medical school, which has led to a real dilution in the standards of the whole medical curriculum and medical education in general. We know that there is a higher rate of sanctioning by residency programs against minority students. So we have a lot of clues in here that there's a problem. But if you ask me, is there direct evidence that I can show you that having some of these minority physicians in has produced less good medical care? I think we're going to have to wait a bit for that. I must say there's a different problem, though. The problem is that this focus on trying to advance students through medical school on the basis of their skin color and other identity characteristics has led to a great deal of patient mistrust, and it's also led to a great deal of physicians being being demeaned because of the fear that the way they achieve whatever they achieve was through affirmative action as opposed to their own ability. So it's harmed everyone. It's harmed the Black physicians who really deserve any credit that they've gotten and the opportunities that they've gotten, who are really quite capable. And it's also harmed the trust associated with that the patient physician interaction must have in order for it to be really successful interaction.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you need that trust. You're in that room with the doctor, and you want what they say to be true, so that you can get better.
One of my
And
colleagues, Kevin Williamson, who's a well-known physician at Temple Medical School, has pointed out that he has Black patients who have told him, "I don't want a Black doctor. I want to make sure I have a white doctor." These are Black patients. That's not what we want in the healthcare system. We don't want this kind of racialization of the healthcare system. We don't want white patients coming in and asking for white doctors. We don't want Black patients coming in asking for Black doctors. We want people coming in and expecting that they're going to get the best care available whenever they have an encounter with the healthcare system.
right, right. All right. Well, then let's turn to, as you alluded to earlier, how do we fix some of this? You founded this group, Do No Harm. Tell us about that, and then we'll kind of unpack what you're doing, particularly on the medical front. And there's a whole host of different lines we can go down as well. But start by just telling us, what is Do No Harm?
Yeah, so Do No Harm is a membership organization. We now have over 50,000 members, about half of whom are healthcare workers, physicians, medical students, administrators, nurses. And our goal is to really get rid of discriminatory practices in healthcare and to extend that to the whole question of gender affirming care and how to prevent children from going through what's turned out to be a very harmful set of activities. We began, as you mentioned, in April of 2022. Um, and our goal was to approach the problem through three routes. One is to inform the public, and we've spent a lot of effort writing op-eds, and that's what got me started in the whole thing. We can talk about that. And then appearing on television shows and debating and whatever we could do to inform the public about these issues. Secondly, is we've had a number of legal cases. And what we've done is when we've identified discriminatory practices, we've launched lawsuits. And I'll give you one example, which is the one that's been recently solved, was our first lawsuit, which was against the federal government. At the end of the Biden administration, they put a rule in Medicare that doctors who cared for Medicare patients would earn extra money if installed in their practice was some sort of anti-racist protocol. They didn't really define exactly what that meant, but the implication was that you had to treat people differently based on their skin color. And we had members who objected to that. They didn't want to treat their patients differently on the basis of skin color, and sued the federal government. And just recently, HHS has decided to drop the lawsuit, which they contested back in the Biden era. But we were winning it in court. We won each court case as we went through the whole system. We've also sued other organizations like Pfizer that had a very rich program. Blacks only, whites and Asians need not apply, that they'd have employment positions, that they'd have extra training, that they pay for a master's degree, that they give them other benefits. And we encounter this over and over and over again in medical schools and as well as in private companies where these programs persist. And even in government and even in red state governments, we find all kinds of examples of state medical boards that require having minorities attached to them. It all represents something that's left over from the civil rights era where there was affirmative action and there was all these ideas that minorities had to be promoted. And we now know that these laws are really unconstitutional. They've been denied now by the Supreme Court, and the time has come to get rid of racism in American life. And as Justice Roberts said, the best way to get rid of racism is to stop acting in racist kinds of ways, which is what's been going on. And the last thing that our organization has done is to really help legislators around the country, as well as at the federal level, to produce laws that are going to guarantee that some of these practices are no longer in existence. You mentioned before how it seems like there's a slippage after the Students for Fair Admissions case, and I think that's quite correct. And we've been helping support legislation around the country that's sought to, particularly in schools that are state supported, to eliminate these kinds of practices by eliminating DEI offices, by making transparent the admission practices, and making sure that hiring does not require a statement supporting DEI principles as opposed to identifying the most qualified people to be faculty members.
So you have three major threads. So this kind of communications, I'll largely lump it there. Litigation, legislation. Is one of those a more powerful lever to pull? Does it depend on the issue, or does it actually take a concerted effort of all three?
Yeah, I think they are mutually supportive, and something that we've done in the informing area that's I think helped support the legislative area is that we've had a fairly extensive research effort. My first article that I wrote in the Wall Street Journal was really a little bit of research about what's gone on in medical education. And that was the one that was called "Take Two Aspirins and Call Me by My Pronouns," that led to a big sort of uproar in medical education and amongst medical students. And that was an example of getting into the both the medical literature and the governmental literature to identify what's really been happening in healthcare. And we have a very extensive research program, and now something called the Center for Accountability in Medicine that's run by Ian Kingsbury and has Jay Green as one of its members. These are two very well respected social scientists who've produced lots of important information that's helped inform legislators. For example, a study that took all of the literature on so-called racial concordance, whether Black patients do better with Black doctors, reviewing all some 60-odd medical publications, reviewing systematic reviews that were done to show that, in fact, there's just no evidence that Black patients prosper if they have a Black physician compared to a white physician. The key is having a good physician. So this kind of information informs our legislative actions, and our advocacy programs through the public, I think, helps inform the legislative portion again. And our legal efforts, I think, help also inform the legislators about issues that really are worthy of attention because they've reached the point where the courts have also um, agreed that they're worthy of real attention and have led to wins that we've had in our legal cases. So I do think they're mutually reinforcing in ways that I think are quite important.
In your normal nonprofit organization, communications, litigation, legislation, that's pretty standard. But you have this additional piece of being a membership organization. What does that do for you?
Well, I think it does two important things. One is it gives us huge amounts of information. And when we look back over all of the efforts that we've had, almost, I would say the majority of these efforts, these lawsuits that we've filed, or even the legislative efforts that we've had, have come through information provided by our members, mostly physicians or nurses, particularly, and occasionally medical students that have really been concerned about something that's gone on in their hospital, their community that's really bothered them. And this has been, of course, particularly true in the so-called gender-affirming care area that I hope we get a chance to speak a little bit about. But so that's been a very important um, component of it, is getting this information. And then, of course, when you have this kind of heft in membership, I think that's convinced many legislators that that we represent individuals that represent a substantial portion of the population, and so I think it's given us heft, as well as, most importantly, it's given us information, and that's been really critical to it.
And those members are med students and doctors and nurses and
Yes, about 50% of them are healthcare workers, doctors and nurses. Probably nurses a large component of them. An interesting story about our membership is our largest membership is in Michigan. And the reason for that is that we created a continuing medical education course in Michigan because it's one of a few states that require a continuing medical education course, an implicit bias, assuming that healthcare disparities are due to the way physicians are biased against minority patients. So they had to take a course in that, and we provided them with an alternative course that said, no, that's not why there are healthcare disparities. We've gone through the real bases for healthcare disparities and talked a lot about the ways that bias is supposed to be assessed and how weak is the science behind assessing whether anybody's biased against anything or not. So, providing that course in Michigan allowed people to get their license renewed, healthcare workers, and not have to go through a training that they found really insulting to them.
And yeah, on your website, you actually invite people to submit some of these stories. I guess it's members and non-members as well. Or is there one of those stories that's really come through that's been kind of a good example of why you solicit those?
Yeah, and actually, probably our one of the great ones was one of our first ones. We have a nurse, Laura Morgan, who's one of the senior individuals in our organization, and she was fired from a position that she had been in for many years at the Baylor Medical System in Texas. Scott and White is the provider in that system and throughout Texas. And she was fired because she had to take an implicit bias test, and they didn't like the answers. She refused to say that she was biased on the test, and they said, unless you're going to change your answers on this little quiz that you're supposed to take as part of your training, we're going to have to fire you. And she said, well, go ahead and fire me. So they did. And she came to us, and then that story became a very important story. It ended up being an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and I think it was real proof that this was a real phenomenon that was hurting nurses and hurting other healthcare workers because it was undermining the trust that the patients had in them and their own sense of what's right and wrong. And, you know, they were very much offended by the idea that they would harm their patients. That's probably one of the great examples. There are many, many others, and that I could cite, but that one has been because it not only produced um, a story that illustrated the problem, but it also produced one of the best staff people that we have.
Well, let's turn to an issue that's even more controversial and divisive than the DEI, and that's of course the gender affirming care, as they call it, these medical procedures through hormones or surgery that attempt to change a person's biological sex. How much of the noise and the outrage here is driven by folks lumping in transgender adults with what's going on with kids? Can we parse that out to start?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. You know, right from the start, when we started to consider this issue, and I'll just, if I can take a moment just to explain why it's part of our mission, is because for really two reasons. One is, as you sort of implied, and I think properly earlier, this is an example of identity politics because all of these children that express so-called gender dysphoria, confusion about their bodies as they start to go through puberty, they've all been treated the same. They're not treated as individuals and to identify their underlying reasons for their concerns and fears and anxieties, but rather they're put into this group. You're a trans kid, and therefore you need to go start on medications and ultimately maybe even have surgical procedures. So it's an identity politics issue. And the other issue is this was something that our donors that we initially went to help us get started in our organization pointed out that it was concerning them. And I, even as a physician, was not terribly aware of what really was going on. But these are our donors had family members or friends whose children had started to go through this, and it seemed to us a really interesting, important problem. And so this was one of the great examples of our donors informing our mission in ways that I found to be extraordinarily valuable. And then once we began to look into this, it was clear that this was a real problem. And as you rightly point out, we have very much separated this issue of pediatric gender dysphoria and gender confusion with adults. You know, I think adults, I think many of them have many psychological problems. That's been very well documented in the transgender community. There's a high suicide rate in that community, but they're adults, and we feel like, you know, they have a right to pursue their lives the way they want. The problem with children is they really can't make these judgments. They can't make these decisions. And this has clearly changed in its characteristics over the years. It used to be the children who and ended up getting these procedures and getting these treatments were children that had expressed gender confusion from their earliest days. And it was a very rare phenomenon, one in 10,000 kind of problem. And now it's become one in several hundred kinds of problems, and maybe even less. And the nature of the children now is mostly teenage girls who start to go through puberty, who express great uh, discomfort with their bodies and the bodily changes that they're experiencing. That's the main audience for these treatments. And right now, unfortunately, what's happened in this country, particularly, while the rest of the world has decided that these treatments are not effective and may be harmful, our country has gone full bore ahead in starting these children with minimal, if any, psychological evaluation, even though they claim that's a requirement. When you look at what actually goes on, they rarely get any sort of intensive psychological treatment. They get started on medications and puberty blockers and hormones, which we know are harmful to them. And we know also that it really doesn't benefit them when the studies have been looked at. And that's been the big debate, is that there's a large literature that's accumulated about these children. It's a terrible literature in the sense that it shows virtually no good evidence that these children are benefited. And yet the practitioners keep pushing this almost as if it's become a religion for them. But again, we've separated out our efforts with with children from any kind of activity with adults, because I think it's a very different situation with adults. But children and parents of children have been coerced into this by being told that their children could commit suicide if they're not allowed to go through these procedures. That's just not true. And I think uh, that's been our real focus, is how can we protect these children?
And it feels like we've made some progress in this area over the last few years. The progressive orthodoxy seems to be turned upside down at least a little bit. And as you mentioned, I mean, there was the Cass report in England that said, "Hey, this is actually a problem. Some of our European friends are turning away from this much faster than we are." As you say, do you feel like we're making progress here? Do you think we're on a glide path towards fixing it?
Well, this is a good reason for organizations like ours. And, there have been a lot of groups involved in this, mostly focusing on informing the public. But I think our efforts about legislation have been critical here. We've been involved in 27 states, having laws passed that have, at one level or another, help to reduce this activity in hospitals. And I think what's really happened now is that many hospitals that were engaged in these activities, and we see one after another children's hospitals around the country saying they're no longer going to pursue this because of the executive order that the president signed right at the beginning of his administration, that saying that they wouldn't fund these hospitals if they pursued this kind of activity. But also in these states around the country, this has become illegal. And we know now there was the Skirmetti case before the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court said that no, these laws, this time initiated by Tennessee, are constitutionally legal, and that the state can pass a law to restrict so-called gender-affirming care. But there are other challenges on other bases that are coming along. But I think between the state legislative efforts, the president's signing of that executive order, the making the public aware of what's really been going on in this gender affirming care, I think we have made some real progress. But we're fighting almost a religion. We're fighting a cultish mentality that's not willing to accept reality, that continues to really dissemble about what the data really show about these children, and continues to push this treatment in ways that are really quite distressing and harmful. And there's no question that harm is being produced here, and there is very, very great deal of question whether there's any evidence at all that there's any benefit to these children. We have no idea how much regret goes on, how many children want to go through so-called detransitioning. That's been one of our legislative goals, is to make sure that these children that change their minds and decide that they really want to live the way they were born, the way God made them, Um, Children like Chloe Cole, famous detransitioner who's been so active around the country. As a matter of fact, there's the Chloe Cole bill in Congress to try to make sure that detransitioners get all of the kinds of treatment and care that they need. And that's been a real focus of our organization.
Yeah.
And we've helped
Yeah.
sponsor Chloe around the country to tell her story.
Yeah. And again, going back to that, you got the hearts and minds communication story coupled with the legislation, coupled with the litigation. You can actually drive some change. Okay, so we've talked about DEI, we've talked about the gender affirming care. Are there other issues really plaguing the medical community right now that we need to bring to the surface that you guys are working on?
Well, we're sticking to our two issues in a very, very careful way. Now, amongst those issues, there are other problems. For example, there's the sort of request that goes on where parents want to know what's going on with their children with regard to their medical records, and there have been real barriers to parents understanding what's going on with their children. You know, there's these school districts that have sort of hidden the transitions that they've tried to promote on children from parents. One of our staff people, January Littlejohn, has been a wonderful advocate for parents, and she works with us closely, and we provide resources to parents whose children suddenly find themselves caught in this whole maelstrom of attempted gender conversions and so on. So we've been fighting against having the medical record be withheld from parents. We've also been really active in trying to make sure that the detransition, as I mentioned before, really have an opportunity to get the right care that they need, even to the point where, when physicians perform services on patients, they have a coding system that's a national system that all the insurance companies, Medicare and Medicaid, all use. There are no codes for detransition, and our medical director, Kurt Maselli, has been working very hard at trying to get instituted these codes, and we've presented at the CDC, which who governs this particular activity, the need for having these codes so that the care that these children can receive as detransitioners to stop these hormones, to stop these puberty blockers, and to deal with the complications that they've produced, that there are codes for that will allow the physicians to be properly compensated for the care of these people and will allow us to also track how many detransitioners there are and what's going on with them. Um, so those are some of the issues we've also been very interested in identifying through our database, Stop the Harm, which hospitals around the country have been most active so that the states and the residents of these states can understand what's happening in their local communities. And I think that's been another example of us bringing information to the legislators that will allow implementation of proper laws around the country that will do something about this real medical tragedy that's gone on.
And is most of that legislative work, is that at the state level, or are you doing things nationally as well?
Well, we're doing things nationally. We work very closely with Representative Greg Murphy and with Representative Burgess Owens, who have introduced bills nationally to get DEI out of medical education. Dr. Murphy, who's the only practicing doctor in Congress, he's a urologist, has felt very, very strongly about this issue and has pushed very hard. He's from North Carolina, um, and you know, uh, so they have something called the Educate Act that they've been promoting, and the goal there is to really get rid of DEI offices, rid of discriminatory admissions to medical school, get rid of discriminatory hiring in medical education, and making sure the public understands what their local medical institutions are really up to. So we've worked at the federal level. Um, and we've worked closely with the White House on many issues that are related to medical education. We've tried to help provide what information we could so that we can help inform their efforts, which have been really quite strong and quite wonderful about trying to eliminate this scourge from medical education and medical care in this country.
Now, the midterms next year are gonna probably disrupt the apple cart a little bit. Does that give you all some pause? Are you kind of making a plan A and plan B, at least on the national level, of what's going to happen to some of these efforts?
Well, plan A is to take advantage of the current situation as much as we can. We feel like this is a crucial year for us and for the attempts to really reform the system the way it's been. We've been going full bore. We have a new ranking system for medical schools that give parents and students an idea of where they can go, where they can help escape some of this DEI stuff, and we're pushing hard on the legislative agenda. We have 10 major legislative goals in DEI and 10 in so-called gender-affirming care. And we're going to work as hard as we can this year to accomplish these goals. And, we need the support of donors who have been so wonderful to us in order to accomplish those goals. I think Plan B, we've lived in Plan B for the last few years before
I
this
guess
current
so.
year. And I think certainly at the state level, we can continue to make real gains. And I think we can continue to provide the kind of information that will eventually win the day. It's the old Winston Churchill aphorism: the American people will do the right thing after they've tried all the alternatives. And we think that by giving the American people the information that's really critical here, I think we'll be able to lead to the right outcome eventually. Certainly with gender affirming care. I think the DEI story is going to be a longer, more difficult, it's kind of a marathon rather than a sprint. But I think gender affirming care, I think it's so clear that the public, as well as the medical establishment, understands the real problems here. We recently did a survey. Ian Kingsbury and Jay Green did a survey in Florida of the of physicians and their attitudes, and it was several hundred physicians. I think something like 700 physicians. um, their attitude about these issues was very much mirrored the public attitude about these issues, and it's really an 80-20 story that people are against children going through these procedures and getting these medications until they have a point in their lives where they're able to make informed decisions about them. So I'm optimistic, even if we're in the minority, that we'll be able to have a real impact. But this year we're in the majority, and we're going to push very hard.
Well, I was going to make my closing question to bring us some optimism, but you did it. You brought us right there. So, Dr. Stanley Goldfarb, really appreciate you going through this. These are not easy issues. They're touchy issues, sensitive issues, but it's really important that the work that Do No Harm is doing, that the other groups that are involved in this are promoting these important issues. It's just big hard work, and we're really glad you're doing it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Peter. Really enjoyed it.
Well, as you can tell, I am not sounding at my best. I've been battling a cold. I thought maybe having a doctor on would magically cure me, but turns out that is not how it works. However, Dr. Goldfarb has diagnosed some real problems in the medical industry, and Do No Harm is doing some phenomenal work in pushing back against these important issues of gender ideology and identity politics, issues, frankly, that most people, I think, would really rather avoid talking about and taking on. And so kudos to them for doing that. You can learn more about Do No Harm's work at donoharmmedicine.org. And I encourage you to do that if this is an issue that matters for you, something you care about. And of course, if it is an issue that matters, DEI or gender ideology issues, there are a lot of other groups also doing good work in this space. And we at Donors Trust would be delighted to introduce you to some of those. Of course, we'd be delighted to help you with your giving broadly. And that is what we do with our donor advised funds that both help you give in a way that's easy, tax friendly, but also in a way that aligns with your principles and values, because that is what we really care about. So go to donorstrust.org to learn more about that and have a better understanding of what we offer, the types of groups we work with, and to contact us to see how we can be helpful to your giving. Well, that is it for this episode of Giving Ventures. We look forward to being back in a couple weeks with a whole new conversation, a whole new topic, as we dive in to help you strengthen your charitable giving and have a real impact for the values you care about. Until then, thank you for being a giver. We'll talk more soon.